Now, to continue in the same theme, because I've started this theme of showing how what was taught to Ouspensky by Gurdjieff in those formative years from 1915 in St. Petersburg, Moscow and St. Petersburg, into the Caucasus in 1917 to 18, in Constantinople 1920 to 1921. Gurdjieff was confronting Ouspensky's existing ideas and Ouspensky's nature, in order to give Ouspensky the possibility of acquiring some sort of self-knowledge. It was not to change him, or to change his nature, or to change his ideas. It was to confront his existing ideas and manifestations, to allow Ouspensky the opportunity to come to some sort of self-knowledge, to know that these were his manifestations, and that these were his ideas, and this was a background to everything he did. Now, I've already suggested some examples of this identification, which is not in Gurdjieff's writings. Buffers, for example, which is not in Gurdjieff's writings. The injunction given to Ouspensky to only talk or only speak when necessary, this is not in Gurdjieff's writings, and I've shown that it's not appropriate for other people, such as myself, who were in fact, or I was in fact, I shall say in the past tense, I was a watcher. And I would observe those around me in conversations or discussions, and in some way I would imagine that I had taken part in it, when in fact the reality was I had not. And I had to come to this self-knowledge by being given the task of speaking whenever it was possible. Whenever there was a lull in a conversation, I had to speak. Whenever there was a chance to speak, I had to speak. I had to tell the jokes. I had to keep the conversation going. It was entirely alien to my nature, and through this I realised and came to the realisation that actually I was a watcher, and that when I imagined, as it were, I was taking part in a conversation, or had taken part in a conversation, the reality was that I had not. So this was a valuable piece of self-knowledge, but it would be wrong if I had been taught what Ouspensky was taught. The task of speaking only when necessary was given to Ouspensky, and is valuable only for Ouspensky because Ouspensky was a talker, and he identified totally with what he was saying, so that when he was talking, he was totally oblivious to anything else and anyone else, and would, as Bukowski says, talk endlessly using his extensive knowledge and experience, but in a superficial way. And Gurdjieff would sometimes sit and look at him with an expression of exasperation on his face as Ouspensky went on and on, or Gurdjieff would interrupt him in full flow to prevent him. So Ouspensky was given the task of not speaking unless it's necessary. But Gurdjieff does not write this because it's only appropriate to Ouspensky and may be inappropriate to other people such as myself, and may even be a harmful thing to other people. So we need to look very carefully at what's in this book, what was taught to Ouspensky in Search of the Miraculous is Ouspensky's record, his diary, if you like, his means of recording for himself, his interpretation of what Gurdjieff taught to him. It's not Gurdjieff's teaching at all. And if we go through the index to In Search of the Miraculous, we find that most of the things in that index, which are, in fact, probably now part of the Gurdjieff tradition, as if Gurdjieff was teaching these things, are not actually in Gurdjieff's writings. And identification is one, buffers is another, not to speak unless it's necessary is another, and so on. Now we can take another example of this, which I think is quite interesting, because Ouspensky was a theosophist at this time when Gurdjieff met him. He was an expert in esoteric subjects. He had an extensive knowledge of these subjects, so he knew about things like astral bodies, the theories of astral bodies, the theories about mental bodies and causal bodies and so on. And this was part of Ouspensky's background. So Gurdjieff was going to confront this. Just as he confronted the social background viewpoint that the universe is dying, that suns are going to die, that planets are going to fall back into their suns and be consumed by them, and that there is therefore no future for the universe at all. Gurdjieff confronted this by presenting straight away to Ouspensky the ray of creation, the completely opposite idea, that the universe is growing and developing, and that the moon is the growing tip of the universe. This contradicts entirely the background information, the background assumptions that Ouspensky had. And we can see this in terms of his esoteric knowledge, because Gurdjieff confronts it. When the topic comes round to astral bodies, of which of course Ouspensky knew a great deal, and was therefore going to ask questions about, it's not part of Gurdjieff's teaching. But when Ouspensky asked, and when the groups talked about astral bodies, Gurdjieff gave the contradictory viewpoint, confronted this knowledge. Because he said that the assumption is that everyone has an astral body. And he says that this is not correct. The majority of people, he says, don't have an astral body. An astral body has to be formed in a man and perfected in a man. It can grow in a man if he acts in the right way, if he behaves in the right way. He can grow his own, as it were, astral body. And this is entirely a confrontation of Ouspensky's assumptions, that everyone has an astral body, or the majority of people have an astral body, and this is just part of the theories, the theosophical and esoteric theories that Ouspensky was imbued with. But Gurdjieff says, no, most people don't have an astral body. And those that do, it may be formed, it may crystallize in them, this marvellous word, it may crystallize in them wrongly, and then it can only be decrystallized by means of terrible sufferings. And Gurdjieff goes on to speak about this chemical mixture in a test tube, a mechanical mixture in a test tube, which has no real unity in it. At one moment, certain chemicals are on the top. At another moment, when you shake it, certain other chemicals are on the top. And this man is like this. And he speaks about the necessity of heating this test tube of chemicals so that fusion will take place and an astral body can be formed. But of course, it's difficult to understand why Ouspensky just did not laugh in his face, because there is no evidence anywhere in organic life, in living things, of a process of crystallization of this kind. Everything that exists in living things grows either from an egg or from a seed. It grows. It does not crystallize. It does not crystallize from a mechanical mixture of chemicals by means of fusion. So it's difficult in a sense to understand why Ouspensky did not just laugh in Gurdjieff's face at this. But in fact, Gurdjieff was probably, or certainly, very clever in the way he presented this ludicrous information to Ouspensky. He presented it in a credible way to confront Ouspensky's own ideas already existing about astral bodies. And so this is another example where we can say this is not in Gurdjieff's teaching. There is nothing in Gurdjieff's writings to speak about this mechanical mixture in a test tube being heated and fusing to form an astral body, or even a body Kesdjan, as Gurdjieff writes about the second body in man. It's not formed in this way. This is nonsense. Gurdjieff does not talk about the formation of the body Kesdjan. He talks about its completion and its perfecting, but he does not speak anywhere about this mechanical mixture of chemicals in a test tube and the need to heat these so that they will crystallize and fuse to form this astral body. This is absolute nonsense. And as I say, it's difficult to understand why Ouspensky did not just laugh in Gurdjieff's face and walk away. It was the power of Gurdjieff and the cleverness with which Gurdjieff could present even the most ludicrous ideas to someone as intelligent as Ouspensky and sound credible. Now I'm reminded by what I've said here, and this is a bit of a freewheeling association, if you like, rather than a pre-planned lecture or talk. But I'm reminded here of the law of the three that Gurdjieff presents to Ouspensky as a major part of his teaching, both in terms of what Ouspensky called cosmology and in terms of psychology, because of course it's Ouspensky who divided Gurdjieff's teaching up. And this is explicit in this book, In Search of the Miraculous. We'll look at this in a moment. But it's Ouspensky who divided Gurdjieff's teaching up into cosmology, lectures on cosmology, as it were, and lectures on psychology. Now, one of the maxims that Gurdjieff used from ancient times, as above, so below, of course, makes the division into cosmology and into psychology a delicate matter. As above, so below. So it's a bit delicate. What and when was Gurdjieff talking about cosmology? Where and when was Gurdjieff talking about psychology? Ouspensky has already made the decision for us in writing this book. So this is one aspect in which this book is different completely from the presentation that Gurdjieff gave, actually, to Ouspensky. Ouspensky is quite explicit about this. I'm not criticizing Ouspensky for this in any way. It has to be pointed out, though, in a commentary on this book, In Search of the Miraculous. Now, when it comes to the law of the three, we find that in the book, Gurdjieff's own writings, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, this is given the name Triamatsi Kamno. And this law, Triamatsi Kamno, is one of the two fundamental laws in this book, according to Beelzebub, which govern the whole of the universe. Now, in this book, there are two completely different presentations of this law. Or, in fact, what I've said is not correct. In the book, The Tales of Beelzebub to His Grandson, there is a presentation of this law which differs completely, and this is what I'm talking about here, from the presentation given in Search of the Miraculous. So in Search of the Miraculous, Gurdjieff, according to Ouspensky's understanding and interpretation of what he said, presents the law of the three. In the book, The Tales of Beelzebub to His Grandson, Gurdjieff writes about the law Triamatsi Kamno. And these two presentations are completely different. So this is something that is quite important, since this is one of the two fundamental laws governing anything according to either Beelzebub or Gurdjieff or Ouspensky, depending upon which aspect of this teaching we're looking at. And these can all be different. To Ouspensky, the law of the three is explained, for example, and Ouspensky explains this in Search of the Miraculous, as something like the baking of bread, where if you put flour as one force of the three forces, and water, the second force of the three forces, together you just get a paste which you can use as a glue if you wish. As children we used to do this. In our impoverished background, childhood, we used to do this. But Gurdjieff says, if you add heat, the third force, then you can bake bread. And the result is that you have something completely different from the flour that you started with, completely different from the water that you started with, and completely different from the heat that you used in the process. So this is the law of the three forces, in Search of the Miraculous. Now in Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, this is referred to by Beelzebub as fusion. And this is a second grade law, so this is something completely different from the law of the three. This is called fusion. Simple. And Beelzebub advises us to study all the different, or advises his grandson, of course, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. He advises his grandson to study all the different forms and manifestations of this second degree law, fusion. So according to Beelzebub, this is not the law of the three, this is a second degree cosmic law called fusion. Now in Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, if we move to the other side of the argument, this is Gurdjieff's writing, then the law Triamatsi Kamno in this book, Beelzebub explains this to his grandson Hassan. Triamatsi Kamno is the law that the higher unites with the lower to actualize the middle, which then either becomes the higher for the succeeding lower or the lower for the succeeding higher. The higher unites with the lower to actualize the middle. So this is actually a law of vibrations, the way a faster vibration can, in a sense, merge with a slower vibration to create a vibration in the middle. This raises the lower vibration up, but brings the higher vibration down. Now this is most evident in what would be called in Search of the Miraculous the food diagrams, although Beelzebub does not explain the food diagrams as explicitly as Ouspensky does. Ouspensky is brilliant for this. But in this process of digestion of food, explained in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, by Beelzebub to his grandson Hassein, then this is known as the second degree law of Harnell-Miatsnell. That is, the higher unites with the lower and actualizes the middle in terms of the food that we take in. So we take in ordinary food and water. It meets the higher vibrations already present in us, that is the processes necessary for the process of digestion, which lifts the food up, raises the food to the next level. And this is called Harnell-Miatsnell. So this is not the law of the three, or not the law of Triamatsi-Campbell. So there's a considerable amount of confusion here about what is, in fact, for many people in the Gurdjieff tradition, the simplest aspect of Gurdjieff's teaching. That is, there are two fundamental laws governing the whole universe: the law of the three and the law of the seven, or the law of the octave. But of course, when we examine the details, we find that this does not hold water. It does not make any sense, because, first of all, the law of the three in Search of the Miraculous, as explained by Gurdjieff according to Ouspensky, does not correspond to the law Triamatsi-Campbell as explained in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. And further, in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, we have these contradictions between the explanation of the law Triamatsi-Campbell, which appears identical with the second degree cosmic law Harnell-Miatsnell. The higher vibrations unite with the lower vibrations to actualize the middle. And of course does not correspond to the law of fusion, which is what is explained, it seems to me, to Ouspensky, as explained by Ouspensky in Search of the Miraculous, as the law of the three by Gurdjieff. So this is a very confused area and does not hold water, in fact, and this is quite a serious matter, given that this is one of the two fundamental world laws. And now, of course, further in this area, I've already explained the differences in these two books, that is to say, In Search of the Miraculous by Ouspensky and Tales of Beelzebub to his grandson by Gurdjieff, how in these two books the explanation of the moon, the sense and significance of the moon in terms of human life and in terms of our cosmology is completely different. And this has already been explained by me, that in Search of the Miraculous, Gurdjieff was introduced to Ouspensky to confront Ouspensky's background views of the nature of the universe, this law, this ray of creation. And the ray of creation is a confrontation, if you like, between Ouspensky's background views of how the nature of the universe, how science views the universe, or viewed the universe at that time, as a dying, something that is going to die, suns are going to burn themselves out, planets fall into their suns and disappear, and the whole universe is going to revert to some sort of formless, shapeless mass. To confront this, Gurdjieff introduces to Ouspensky the ray of creation, in which is completely different. The ray of creation, the universe is rather like the branch of a tree, a growing branch, and the tip of this growing branch, the growing tip of this ray of creation, is the moon. The moon is growing to become a planet, planets grow to become suns, and so on. So it's a contradiction or confrontation with existing viewpoints. And the important thing about this is that the moon is therefore in its rightful place as the growing tip of the ray of creation. Now, the minute we go into Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, even in the first few chapters that most people are able to read, then a completely different picture emerges of the moon. The moon is the accidental result of a miscalculation on the part of a sacred individual, which means that a comet collides with the Earth, and the Earth splits into three parts, one of which is the moon, which flies off into space. Another is a smaller part called Anulios, which flies into space, and the other is the Earth. And so the moon is the accidental result of a miscalculation on the part of a sacred individual, which results in this terrible catastrophe, and the various measures taken to deal with this catastrophe have led to mankind's sorry state and situation. So in this view, it's completely different. The moon is no longer the glowing tip of the ray of creation. It's no longer in its rightful place. It's the result of a terrible accident, and our situation as human beings is further a result or consequence of this terrible accident and the actions taken as a result of this terrible accident. So these are completely different views of the moon. And as I've said, the significance of this is enormous, because if the moon is not the growing tip of the ray of creation, if there is not in fact a ray of creation in the sense that Gurdjieff described it to Ouspensky, then from this ray of creation, of course, Gurdjieff derives the table of hydrogens. From the table of hydrogens are derived all the other tables and diagrams in the book In Search of the Miraculous, including the food diagrams, which are so important. And so none of this, in terms of the picture presented in Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, is true or valid, because we no longer have the ray of creation from which the table of hydrogens is derived. So these are considerable differences between these two teachings, considerable perhaps being an understatement even. These are completely different teachings. Vous avez raison. Vous m'avez rappelé en ordre, c'est vrai. I digressed in what I was saying. But let me remind you of something in this context. I'm justifying myself here in the face of your challenge. What I will say is, if you look at the book In Search of the Miraculous, of course, and I've explained this before, there are two completely different descriptions or definitions of what is referred to as self-remembering. Two completely different definitions or descriptions of self-remembering in this book In Search of the Miraculous. And they are mixed up, perhaps, or one is taken as a true definition and the other is conveniently forgotten. In some way they are mixed up or mélangés, confused, in his book In Search of the Miraculous. Now Gurdjieff, according to Ouspensky's interpretation of what he said to him, Gurdjieff says that the chief feature of the being, listen to this, the being of the ordinary man, is his inability to remember himself. Now this is used as the term, the inability to remember himself, in a quite normal sense, that he can't remember his appointments. Gurdjieff is quite explicit, according to Ouspensky, that a man can't remember his promises, made either to himself or made to other people. A man starts work in one direction and with one definite aim, but in the course of that forgets what direction he was working in. He forgets his aim and ends up working in a completely different direction, in a completely different way, and achieving perhaps completely different results. This is the central feature of a man's being, B-E-I-N-G. That this inability to remember himself. That's one meaning in this book In Search of the Miraculous, of this term self-remembering in effect, because it uses the word remembering and involves the self. It's the chief feature of a man's being is his inability to remember himself. Now, the confusion comes because Ouspensky records Gurdjieff as saying that there are four types or four classes of consciousness in the ordinary man. There is sleep, in your bed at night, waking sleep, the ordinary state of the ordinary man. There is consciousness of self, and there is objective consciousness. And the ordinary man possesses primarily, and 99.9% of the time, the two states of sleep and waking sleep, and that's it. He occasionally experiences moments of consciousness of self, but does not distinguish them from waking sleep. Now the confusion arises because Ouspensky records Gurdjieff as saying that the state of consciousness of self, in this classification of four types or layers of consciousness, is analogous to the state of self-remembering, in inverted commas. But of course, this is then seized upon by Ouspensky, who was extremely interested in consciousness and in cosmic consciousness, in the Western sense of consciousness. And Ouspensky then went on, and we can show this in his own teaching, in Ouspensky's teaching from 1921 to 1941 in London. Ouspensky seized upon this idea of self-remembering as a level of consciousness, and conveniently forgot, as it were, about the true definition of self-remembering, in the sense that this is the central quality of the ordinary man's being, his inability to remember himself, which has nothing to do with self-remembering as analogous to the state of consciousness of self. So these are two things. One is about being, and the being of the ordinary man, his inability to remember himself. The other is a definition, a precise definition, using the term self-remembering as analogous to the state of consciousness of self. So these are two completely different definitions or descriptions of self-remembering given by Ouspensky in Search of the Miraculous. And Ouspensky went on to primarily teach self-remembering as a state of consciousness, rather than self-remembering as the central feature of a man's being. Now, what's the point of this? Well, I've digressed, because in this definition of self-remembering, man's inability to remember himself as a state of being in the ordinary, and Gurdjieff says to Ouspensky that we start off in one direction and we end up forgetting what we were doing and going off in a different direction. So my whole point in saying this is that I have gone off in a different direction, but I haven't forgotten myself, because I know where I'm going. So let me get back on track, or try to get back on track with what I started off saying in this series of talks. Now my point was, in introducing this idea of the astral body, or what Gurdjieff refers to actually in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson as the body Kezdjan. And there is a difference between these two books, because in Search of the Miraculous, of course, a man has four bodies, according to Gurdjieff, according to Ouspensky. That is to say, he has his physical body, he has the possibility of an astral body, he has the possibility of a mental body, and he has the possibility of a causal body. Each of these bodies existing at different layers or strata, and subject to different laws. Of course, in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, there is none of this. A man has his planetary body, as it were. A man has the body Kezdjan, which is in various states of completion or of perfection, and he has what Gurdjieff, or rather Beelzebub, refers to as the body of the soul. So there are three bodies in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, four bodies in Search of the Miraculous, three bodies in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. So there is no way that these can be the same teaching. Four bodies in Search of the Miraculous, three bodies in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. Now the significance of this, and I'll just use this term astral body because we are familiar with it and it has an easy sound and many people will understand what I'm talking about. But in preparing a commentary on this book, In Search of the Miraculous, and therefore referring in fact to this book as Ouspensky's record of his interpretation of what Gurdjieff taught to him, I'm also going to be referring, of course, to Gurdjieff's teaching, in the sense that In Search of the Miraculous is not Gurdjieff's teaching. If I'm referring to what Gurdjieff was actually teaching and teaching to Ouspensky, then there is this idea of the carrot and the stick. Gurdjieff used this in a very powerful way. He created the carrot that most people don't have an astral body, but we can acquire one if we work in particular ways. And then there is the stick, that if you don't have an astral body, then what happens when you die? Do we possess immortality or not? Ouspensky has constructed a whole series of talks, as if given by Gurdjieff, about and around this concept of immortality and the possibility of life after death. So this is a feature both of In Search of the Miraculous and of Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, because Gurdjieff presents his teaching in a very, as I say, in a very powerful way. He presents these ideas in very crucial, very emotive areas. And this astral body is one example of this. We have the carrot, we have the possibility of acquiring a higher being body, a higher body. And therefore, we have the possibility, says Gurdjieff, of perhaps existing after death. It is a strong carrot, an emotive carrot. But there is also the situation of the ordinary man who does not have the astral body, does not work in a particular way. And indeed, in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, Beelzebub is quite explicit that, therefore, the ordinary man, upon his death, is destroyed forever, such as he is. And we can interpret that in any way we want. But this is a very powerful stick which prompts us to go on to work in specific ways, to try to acquire this astral body, or in the case of Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, the body Kesjan. And this carrot and the stick occurs in Gurdjieff's teaching in both of these books in a very powerful and, as I say, very emotive way. Gurdjieff is trying to motivate us using the carrot and the stick at the same time towards work upon oneself, in the form that he understands it, remembering, of course, that work upon oneself is not about self-change, it is about self-study. If we work upon ourselves towards self-change, this does not work and only makes our situation worse. This is our basic problem as ordinary men and women. Therefore, Gurdjieff says there is a very narrow path. It's the eye of the needle. We've got to try and get the camel through the eye of the needle. It is the path of self-study. Know thyself. And the work upon oneself that we undertake consists of limited and supervised tasks for the purpose of acquiring each time one piece of self-knowledge. It is about self-study, self-knowledge, know thyself. And this is an area that I've said elsewhere is not adequately brought out in the Gurdjieff tradition. It is not brought out in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, but it is fundamental. There must be, at the beginning of any attempt to work on oneself, the explicit and powerfully put difference between work upon oneself, a self-change which does not work and only makes our situation worse, and self-study, know thyself, which is quite different and consists of limited and supervised tasks for the purpose of acquiring some knowledge of oneself, however small that might be, given that that knowledge in the course of time inevitably results in that it happens that change takes place in a harmonious and natural way, as opposed to work upon oneself for the purpose of self-change, which does not work and only makes our situation worse. So we've got to bring out these two different ideas about work upon oneself, first in a very powerful way, and then the carrot and the stick that Gurdjieff produces in both versions of his teaching comes into effect, motivating us like the donkey. And here, before I remember, I must say that Gurdjieff does not use the term donkey meaning something stupid. A donkey for Gurdjieff is something that works. If Gurdjieff wanted to say you were stupid, he would call you a cow. You look at me like cow. Vash. Donkey for Gurdjieff was something that worked.